In the South, in the 1940s, the sun hung low over the small, dusty town of Magnolia Ridge, casting long, thin shadows across the dirt roads. This town, like so many others in the segregated South, thrived on an unspoken, but strictly enforced code. Black people stayed on one side of town, white people on the other. You knew your place and kept it. There was no room for deviation. It was a world of quiet but persistent violence, where the weight of centuries of injustice lingered like the suffocating heat of a summer's day. But there was always a small, rebellious flicker, a spark of something that dared to resist, to dream, to love in a world that forbade it. The story of Aaron Walker and Lydia Hawthorne was one such spark. Aaron was a large, broad-shouldered man, his skin a rich, deep brown that gleamed in the sunlight. He wasn't the kind of man who you would expect to stand out in a crowd. He wasn't handsome by society's standards. He was heavyset, the product of a lifetime of hard labor, his body shaped by years of working in the cotton fields, lifting sacks, and sweating under the relentless sun. But there was something in Aaron's eyes that people could not forget. His gaze held an intensity that spoke of quiet defiance, of resilience, and of a world far bigger than the one he was forced to inhabit. Lydia Hawthorne was a vision of a different world entirely. Slender and fair-skinned, with golden hair that glowed like a halo under the afternoon sun, Lydia was everything that society celebrated. She was an athlete, a track star at the local college, a symbol of grace and beauty. But in her chest beat a heart that yearned for something more than the life she was expected to live. They met in the most unlikely of places, a dusty old library, tucked away in the heart of Magnolia Ridge. Aaron had been working late, his hands stained with ink as he wrote in a ledger, keeping records for the local store. Lydia had come to do research for her upcoming track meet, where she would run against the best athletes in the state. Their eyes met across the room, a fleeting moment that neither could forget. She was reading a book about philosophy, her brow furrowed in concentration. He, with his massive frame hunched over the table, caught a glimpse of her delicate profile, and something stirred within him, an ache, a longing. He had never seen someone like her before, so full of life, so untouched by the world's cruelties. She caught his gaze for a moment, then looked away quickly, a blush creeping up her neck. It was the first time she'd ever really seen a black man up close, not as a servant, not as someone who worked for her father. But there was something in his eyes that drew her in, something she couldn't name. And so, as the days passed, their paths crossed more and more. He was always there in the library, in the corner where the dusty shelves lined the walls. She would come to study, but she found herself distracted by him. And he would linger, pretending to focus on his work, but always watching her from the periphery, like a man who has lived his whole life in the shadows and is now afraid to step into the light. One evening, it happened. They spoke. It was simple, just a question about a book. But the moment it passed between them, an unspoken understanding settled in the air. They both knew the danger. They knew it wasn't just the social norm that stood between them. It was the law. The very fabric of their world was woven with the strictest rules of segregation. For a black man and a white woman to be seen in public together, to speak as equals, to show affection, was not just frowned upon. It was a crime, a death sentence. And yet, when Lydia turned to leave, Aaron couldn't help himself. He spoke her name, soft, tentative. "Lydia!" She froze for a moment, then turned back, her heart pounding in her chest. The tension between them was palpable, electric. Neither of them moved. They stood there in that small library, the world outside raging with hatred, with fear. But for just a moment, they allowed themselves to imagine a life where they could be free, where the weight of history wasn't pressing down on them. They began to meet in secret, late at night, in the shadows of the forest on the outskirts of town, where the moonlight was their only witness. Aaron was always cautious, always terrified that someone might see, might hear. He was a man who knew what it meant to be hunted, to be treated as less than human. But with Lydia, he felt something he hadn't felt before, a spark of hope. She, too, was afraid of the wrath of her family, of the town, of the violence that might come if anyone found out. But the pull between them was too strong. She would run for miles, finding him in the quiet of the night, and they would speak of dreams, of what might be if the world were different. Lydia would touch his hand, as though the simple act could burn away the years of fear and hatred that separated them. They would kiss, softly at first, but the need grew, a desperation they couldn't control. They were drawn together like two stars in a sky too dark to be seen by anyone else, but burning for each other nonetheless. But even as they clung to each other, the world around them was closing in. There were whispers in town, rumors that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't long before Lydia's father, a wealthy and influential man in Magnolia Ridge, caught wind of the affair. He knew Aaron, had seen him in town before, but had never given him much thought. Now, the sight of his daughter with him, of the forbidden love that was growing between them, made his blood boil. He ordered his daughter to stay away from the black man, threatening her with disownment if she disobeyed. Lydia was torn between her love for Aaron and her loyalty to her family, the only world she had ever known. Aaron, too, faced the weight of the world pressing down on him. He knew that to be with her meant losing everything, his dignity, his family, even his life. But the love between them was undeniable, and they both knew they couldn't live without it. The world was changing slowly, but it was still a world of fear. The day Aaron's worst fears came true arrived with the sun blazing high in the sky, and the crack of a gunshot shattered the fragile bubble they had built. He had been walking home when the men from the town, those who had always hated him simply for breathing, ambushed him in the street. Lydia had heard the commotion, had seen the men pull Aaron into an alley. She tried to scream, tried to run, but the world seemed to slow down, to blur into an image of horror she couldn't escape. The men beat Aaron senseless, their fists landing with cruel, practiced precision, their hatred bleeding through every strike. Lydia's screams were drowned out by their laughter, and as they disappeared into the distance, leaving Aaron bruised and broken on the cobblestone street, she was left with nothing but the haunting realization that her love had cost him everything. It was a moment that would change them both forever, a moment that made the world shift beneath their feet. What neither of them knew was that Aaron was hiding something he would never tell Lydia. As he lay dying, his breath shallow, his skin pale, he whispered a secret he had kept from her, from everyone. He had been part of something long before he met Lydia, something he could never escape. A revelation that, in the end, would shatter everything she thought she knew about their love and about him. Lydia knelt beside Aaron, her hands trembling as she touched his bruised face. Blood stained his lips, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The world around them blurred. The laughter of the men who had done this still echoed in her ears, the distant hum of cicadas filling the unbearable silence between them. "Aaron," she whispered, tears streaking her pale cheeks. "Stay with me. Please." He tried to smile, but even that small act sent pain searing through his body. His fingers, thick and calloused from years of labor, reached up weakly, tracing the edge of her jaw. "I ain't got much time, Lydia," he murmured, his voice barely a breath. "I gotta tell you something, before it's too late." Lydia shook her head violently, refusing to believe what was happening. "No, you're going to be okay. I'll get help. We'll run away. We'll leave this town. I don't care where we go, New York, California, anywhere, just as long as we're together." But Aaron's eyes, dark and full of knowing, said otherwise. He had always known this was how it would end. From the moment their love had begun, he had known it was only a matter of time before the world came to collect its debt. "I ain't who you think I am," he whispered, and there was something in his voice that sent a chill through her, even in the sweltering night air. "Lydia, I've been part of something bigger than just you and me." Her heart pounded. "What are you talking about?" Aaron coughed, his body racked with pain, but he forced himself to continue. "Years ago, before I met you, I was running messages for folks. Not just any folks. Rebels. Freedom fighters. Men and women who wanted to burn down everything this town stands for. I helped move people, runaways, slaves' sons and daughters. Even though slavery's been dead a long time, we still had to run like we was being hunted. I helped them disappear, helped them find new names, new lives. And your daddy, your family, they was the ones hunting us down. Lydia's breath hitched, the words slamming into her like a violent wave. My father? Aaron nodded weakly. He made his money keeping men like me in chains. Not real chains, not anymore, but chains all the same. He sent men after us, had him lynched, had him beaten. And all this time, I've been hiding right under his nose. Lydia felt the air rush from her lungs, the weight of her family's sins pressing down on her like an unbearable weight. Why didn't you tell me? Her voice broke, her hands gripping his torn shirt, shaking him as though she could will life back into his failing body. Aaron smiled faintly, the edges of his lips barely curving. Because I loved you, and I didn't want you to hate yourself for loving me. Lydia felt something inside her shatter. She wanted to scream, to deny it, to tell him that nothing, not her father, not the past, not even the hatred that surrounded them, could change the way she felt about him. But Aaron's breath was growing fainter, his eyelids fluttering. The stars above them blurred through her tears. Aaron, don't go. Please don't leave me, she sobbed, pressing her forehead against his. You are the only good thing in my life. He exhaled one last, shuddering breath, and then silence. Lydia didn't move. The world around her didn't matter anymore. The night stretched endlessly, and she sat there, cradling his lifeless body, whispering his name over and over, as if saying it enough times could bring him back. But the world was cruel, and love had never been enough to save them. She didn't know how long she sat there before she heard the distant sound of boots on gravel. She knew who it was before she even looked up. Sheriff Donovan, her father's closest friend. His voice was low and cold when he spoke. Lydia, you need to stand up. You shouldn't be here. She turned slowly, her eyes hollow, her face streaked with Aaron's blood. You did this, she whispered, but it wasn't a question. It was a statement. The sheriff sighed, adjusting his belt. Your daddy's been real patient with you, girl. But this was bound to happen. Lydia stared at him, the weight of everything crushing down on her. She wanted to fight, to scream, to tear him apart with her bare hands. But there was nothing left inside her. Just a cold, empty void. Go home, Lydia, Donovan said, his voice almost gentle. Forget about this. It's over. Lydia laughed then, a hollow, broken sound. It's never over, she whispered. And then, without another word, she stood. She walked past the sheriff, past the men who had watched Aaron die, past the ghosts that now haunted every inch of Magnolia Ridge. She walked until her legs gave out, until the sun began to rise, until she realized that she would never escape what had happened. But she would not forget. She would not let the world erase Aaron Walker's name. And deep in her heart, she made a promise. The town of Magnolia Ridge would pay for what it had done, one way or another. The days after Aaron's death passed in a haze, though Lydia could not tell if it was time moving too quickly or too slowly. Magnolia Ridge went on as if nothing had happened, as if a man had not been beaten to death in an alley while the stars bore silent witness. The white folks went to church on Sundays, tipping their hats to one another, exchanging polite nods and pleasantries. The black folks whispered among themselves, their eyes downcast, knowing better than to speak too loudly about what had been done. They knew justice would not come. It never did. Lydia had not spoken a word since that night. She had gone home, had stood in front of her father, as he paced the parlor, his voice laced with fury, telling her that he had warned her, that she had brought this on herself, that he had cleaned up her mess, and that she would thank him one day. She had not responded. She had simply stared at him with eyes that felt like hollowed-out pits, until even he had grown uncomfortable and left her alone. But something inside her had awakened. A fire that had not been there before. A rage that was not just her own but Aaron's and every other soul that had suffered beneath men like her father. She did not cry. She did not scream. Instead, she waited. She listened. She planned. Magnolia Ridge had long thrived on its secrets, on the way it swept its sins under the rug and pretended they were not there. But Lydia had grown up among the men who ran the town, the businessmen, the politicians, the enforcers of the old way. She knew their secrets. She knew where the bodies were buried. And she knew how to set a fire so great it would consume them all. She started small. The first was Sheriff Donovan. He was a cautious man, too clever to be caught in his own corruption, but he had a weakness, his love for whiskey. Lydia watched him drink himself into a stupor at the town bar, saw the way he barely made it home some nights, staggering down the darkened streets, oblivious to the world around him. So one night, when the town was asleep, she followed him. She waited until he stumbled into his house, until he collapsed into his chair by the fireplace, bottle in hand. Then she stepped inside, silent as a ghost. His gun was on the table beside him, but he was too drunk to reach for it when he saw her. "Lydia?" he slurred, blinking blearily at her. "What in God's name?" She raised the poker from the fireplace and swung. The blow landed with a sickening crunch. He gasped, his body jerking, his hands clawing at the air, but she did not stop. She thought of Aaron, of the way he had suffered, of the way men like Donovan had laughed while they killed him. She thought of all the others, the ones she had never known, the ones who had been erased. She did not stop until Donovan was nothing more than a lifeless heap on the floor, his blood pooling around him like spilled ink. She stood over him for a long time, her chest rising and falling with the force of her breath, then turned and walked out into the night, unseen, unheard. The town awoke to the news of the sheriff's murder with hushed whispers and nervous glances. They buried him quickly, and no one dared ask too many questions. But Lydia was not finished. Next was Mr. Grayson, the banker who had denied loans to every black family that had ever come through his doors, who had stolen land and livelihoods with the stroke of a pen. He prided himself on his wealth, on the way Magnolia Ridge's economy ran through his hands. But he had grown complacent. Lydia knew where he kept his records, the ones he thought were hidden away, the ones that proved his crimes. One night, she broke into his office, stole the papers, and sent them to the state authorities. The scandal broke within days. Grayson was arrested, dragged out of his office in front of the town he had once controlled. He screamed about a conspiracy, about lies, but no one listened. The town was turning on its own, and Lydia was only just beginning. Then there was her father. She had saved him for last. The man who had built Magnolia Ridge into what it was, the man who had ordered Aaron's death without a second thought. He had spent his life believing himself untouchable. But Lydia had been patient. She had been careful. And she had learned his weaknesses better than anyone. The night she went to him, he was in his study, sipping his favorite bourbon, staring into the fireplace as if the flames could burn away his sins. He did not hear her enter. "Father!" she said, and he turned, startled by the sound of her voice. He had not heard her speak in weeks. "Lydia," he said slowly, setting down his glass. "It's late. You should be asleep." She smiled, a small, cold thing. "So should you." He studied her, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "What's this about?" "Aaron Walker," she said simply, watching as his face darkened. "I loved him." Her father's hands tightened into fists. "That's over, Lydia. You know that. You need to move on." "I know," she said, taking a slow step forward. "I also know that the world is changing. That men like you won't be in power forever. And that when people look back on this town, they'll remember what you did." His jaw clenched. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" she whispered, tilting her head. "I know every deal you've made, every secret you've kept. And I know that if the right people were to find out, Your world would crumble. He rose to his feet, towering over her. You wouldn't dare. She smiled again, softer this time. Wouldn't I? For the first time in his life, she saw fear in his eyes. And it was beautiful. The next morning, her father was gone. The official story was that he had left town on urgent business, but Lydia knew better. She had given him a choice, run or be exposed. He had chosen the coward's way out, disappearing into the night like a ghost. Magnolia Ridge would never be the same. The town did not know what had changed, only that something had shifted, that the power that had once ruled them with an iron fist had begun to unravel. Lydia remained, walking the streets like a shadow, her presence a reminder of the past, of what had been lost, of what had been avenged. But she did not feel victorious. There was no joy in what she had done, only emptiness. She visited Aaron's grave often, sitting beside the simple headstone, running her fingers over his name. I did it, she would whisper. I burned it all down. But there was no answer. There never would be. She had one, but it had cost her everything. And in the end, love had not saved them. Only fire had. Lydia sat by Aaron's grave long after the town had begun to change, long after the men who had ruled Magnolia Ridge with blood and money had either fled or fallen. She traced his name in the cool stone, her fingers shaking, though she did not know if it was from grief or the exhaustion of carrying so much weight on her shoulders. The wind stirred the grass around her, whispering through the trees, and she closed her eyes, listening for his voice in the rustling leaves. But there was only silence. There was always silence now. Magnolia Ridge was no longer the same place it had been the night Aaron died. The town had grown uneasy, restless, its people murmuring about the strange shift in power, the inexplicable downfall of men who had once seemed untouchable. No one knew who was responsible, no one except Lydia, and she kept that truth buried deep inside her like a hidden blade. She had done what she set out to do, but it had not given her peace. It had not brought Aaron back. And so she stayed, lingering in the ruins of the life she had destroyed, unsure of what to do with herself now that her revenge had been taken. Then, one evening, just as the sun bled red and gold across the horizon, a letter arrived. It was left on her doorstep, tucked into a plain envelope, her name scrawled across it in a hand she did not recognize. Lydia hesitated before picking it up, the weight of the paper feeling heavier than it should have. She stepped inside, lit a lamp, and unfolded the note with careful fingers. The words were brief, but they sent a cold tremor through her bones. Asterisk, we know what you did. We know who you are. And we're coming. Asterisk, Lydia's heart pounded. She read the words again, slower this time, but they did not change. Her breath came sharp and shallow, and for the first time since she had begun her quiet war against Magnolia Ridge, she felt something close to fear. Whoever had written this knew the truth, and they wanted her to know that she was not as invisible as she had thought. She forced herself to breathe, to think. The letter had not been signed. That meant it could have been from anyone, someone in town who had pieced things together, a survivor of the old guard seeking vengeance, or worse, someone from outside of Magnolia Ridge, someone who had been watching from a distance, waiting for the right moment to strike. She could not afford to wait and find out. That night, Lydia packed a bag. She had stayed here for too long, walking among ghosts and ashes, pretending she still had something to hold on to. But Magnolia Ridge had never truly been hers. It had been Aaron's. And he was gone. Before dawn, she left. She did not look back. She traveled north, moving through towns and cities, keeping her head low, her name false. She learned to survive in the spaces between places, among strangers who asked no questions, among those who carried their own secrets in their pockets. But she never felt safe. The letter haunted her, following her from one town to the next, its shadow lurking behind every corner. Weeks passed, then months. The world was changing, but Lydia could not tell if it was for better or worse. The civil rights movement had begun to stir in the air, quiet at first, then louder, growing in force like a storm on the horizon. She heard whispers of protests, of marches, of men and women standing up against the same kind of hatred that had taken Aaron from her. She wanted to believe it would make a difference. She wanted to believe that what she had done in Magnolia Ridge had not been in vain. But then, one evening, in a city far from the south, she found another letter waiting for her at the boarding house where she was staying. "You can't run forever." Lydia's hand shook as she held the note. The room around her felt too small, the air too thick. She turned, glancing toward the window, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Outside, the street was quiet, the gaslights flickering in the autumn wind. But she knew someone was watching. They had always been watching. She was not afraid to die. She had made peace with that a long time ago. But there was something else now, something she had not expected. A flicker of hope. The world was shifting, rising against the chains that had bound it for too long. If she was being hunted, it meant that she had mattered. That her fight had mattered. That Aaron's death had not been just another forgotten tragedy. Lydia exhaled, slow and steady. Then she picked up a pen and wrote 3 words on the back of the note before folding it and tucking it into her pocket. "Come find me." And then she waited. Lydia did not sleep that night. She sat by the window, staring out at the empty street below, the gaslights casting long shadows against the brick buildings. The note burned in her pocket, its weight heavier than it should have been, as if the words carried something more than ink. She thought of Aaron, of the way he had smiled even in the face of danger, the way he had held her hand in the darkness, and whispered about a future they would never see. She thought of Magnolia Ridge, of the men who had ruled it, of the fire she had left smoldering in their wake. And she thought of the letter, of the unseen presence that had followed her across the country, watching, waiting. She did not know who they were. But she knew they would come. The first time she saw them, she was in Chicago. It had been months since the last letter, and she had begun to believe, foolishly, that she had outrun them. She had found work at a small diner near the South Side, pouring coffee for men who talked about revolution in hushed voices, their words brimming with a kind of urgency she understood all too well. She listened, always listening, always watching. And then, one afternoon, she felt it, that sensation, that prickling at the back of her neck, that awareness of being observed. She glanced up just in time to see him. A man in a dark suit, standing across the street, his eyes locked onto hers through the glass window. He did not move, did not blink. He was just there, a silent reminder that she was not forgotten. She did not run. Not this time. Instead, she finished her shift, walked out of the diner, and crossed the street toward him. He did not back away. Up close, he was older than she had expected, gray at the temples, his face lined with something that looked like exhaustion rather than malice. "Lydia Mercer," he said, and hearing her real name after so long sent a chill through her. "Do I know you?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "Not yet," the man replied, his gaze unwavering. "But I know you." He reached into his coat pocket, and for a brief moment, Lydia's muscles tensed, her mind flashing back to the men in Magnolia Ridge, to the violence, to the fear. But he did not pull out a weapon. He handed her a letter. Another one. "They're looking for you," he said, his voice quieter now. "They haven't forgotten what you did." Lydia met his eyes, searching for an answer in them. "Who are you?" "A friend," he said simply. "And if you're smart, you'll leave the city before they get here." He turned and walked away before she could ask anything more, disappearing into the crowd like he had never been there. Lydia stood there for a long time before unfolding the letter. This one was different from the others. It was not a threat. It was an invitation. If you want the truth, come to New Orleans. The address was written below, nothing else. No name, no explanation. Just a destination. Lydia hesitated. She could ignore it. She could keep running, keep hiding, keep living in the shadows of the life she had chosen. But she was tired. and she was done being afraid. So 2 nights later, she'd boarded a train heading south. The journey felt like stepping backward through time. The closer she got to Louisiana, the more the past pressed in on her, the weight of it settling on her shoulders, like a ghost she could not shake. The air was thick with heat, the scent of magnolias and damp earth filling the spaces between breaths. New Orleans was nothing like Magnolia Ridge, but it carried the same undercurrent of danger, the same quiet knowledge that power here ran deep, tangled in roots that had been growing for generations. The address led her to a small bar tucked away in the French Quarter, its windows glowing with warm light, the sound of jazz spilling into the streets. She stepped inside, scanning the room. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just men and women drinking, laughing, losing themselves in the music. But then, at a table near the back, she saw him. The man from Chicago. And he was not alone. Lydia approached slowly, every instinct telling her to turn and walk away, but she ignored it. She had come too far. "Sit," the man said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. She hesitated for only a moment before lowering herself into the seat. "Why am I here?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. The man leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Because you need to know the truth." Lydia folded her arms. "And what truth is that?" The man exchanged a glance with the woman sitting beside him, a dark-skinned woman with keen eyes, the kind that saw too much. "What you did in Magnolia Ridge," the woman said, "didn't go unnoticed. You set fire to something bigger than that town." Lydia frowned. "I don't understand." The man sighed. "You didn't just take down a few corrupt men, Lydia. You disrupted an entire network. Magnolia Ridge wasn't just a town, it was a stronghold. A place where powerful men did their business in the shadows. The people you destroyed, they were part of something much larger." Lydia's pulse quickened. "Larger?" The woman nodded. "And now, the men who lost everything because of you want revenge." Lydia swallowed hard, the full weight of what they were saying settling over her like a lead blanket. She had thought Magnolia Ridge was the end. She had thought she had one. But she had only pulled at a thread, and now the whole web was unraveling. "Then why bring me here?" she asked. The man leaned closer. "Because there's another war coming, and we think you should be part of it." Lydia stared at him, her mind racing. She had spent so long believing she was alone, that what she had done had been hers alone to bear. But now they were telling her that her fight was not over, that there were others, that she was not alone. She exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "Tell me everything." And so they did. The man's name was Elijah Carter, and the woman was Josephine Toussaint. Lydia listened as they spoke in low, measured voices, telling her about the network she had unknowingly disrupted, the men she had angered, and the war that had been simmering beneath the surface long before she struck her first blow in Magnolia Ridge. They called it the Order, the old money families, the businessmen, the sheriffs, the plantation descendants who had never truly let go of their grip on the South. It was not just a handful of corrupt men, not just a town poisoned by hatred and fear. It was something bigger, something woven into the very foundation of America, something that thrived in the dark where no one could see it. And Lydia, without realizing it, had set a fire too close to its roots. The men who had once ruled Magnolia Ridge had been powerful, but they had also been replaceable. Their fall had been an inconvenience, not a true defeat. But what had made Lydia dangerous, what had made her a target, was the way she had done it. She had not just killed a sheriff or ruined a banker. She had made the people of Magnolia Ridge afraid. She had made them question, whisper, wonder if the power they had always feared was truly as untouchable as they had been led to believe. And that, more than anything, was what the Order could not allow. Elijah leaned forward, his dark eyes steady. "They don't just want revenge, Lydia. They want to make an example of you. To remind everyone what happens when you step out of line." Lydia exhaled slowly, her fingers curling against the worn wooden table. "Then why bring me here?" Josephine tilted her head, studying her. "Because we've been fighting them for a long time. And now, thanks to you, they're afraid. That means it's time to push." Lydia let the words settle over her, the weight of them pressing against the exhaustion that had lived in her bones for so long. She had spent months running, hiding, waiting for the past to catch up with her. And now it had. But instead of a noose around her neck, it was an offer. A chance to strike first. She thought of Aaron, of the way he had believed in a future that had never come. She thought of the men who had killed him, the ones who had stood by and watched, and the ones who had whispered about justice but had done nothing. And she thought of the letter, of the unseen force that had followed her, watching, waiting for the moment to drag her back into the dark. Lydia lifted her chin. "What do you need me to do?" Elijah and Josephine exchanged a look, and then Josephine slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "There's a man," she said. "His name is William Ashford. He's one of them." Lydia unfolded the paper, scanning the name, the address beneath it. "New Orleans?" Elijah nodded. "He operates out of a club in the quarter. Looks like a respectable businessman, but he's not. He launders money for the order, funds the men who hunt people like you. People like us." Lydia glanced up, her heart beating a little faster now. "And you want me to get rid of him?" Josephine smiled, slow and sharp. "We want you to do what you do best." Lydia exhaled, the weight of the moment settling over her. She had thought Magnolia Ridge had been the end. But it was only the beginning. She stood, tucking the paper into her pocket. "Tell me where to start." The club was called the Red Orchid, a place where men in expensive suits laughed over brandy, while women in silk dresses whispered in their ears. It smelled of cigars and old money, of things that had been passed down for generations, secrets wrapped in velvet and gold. Lydia had spent her life around men like William Ashford, men who ruled without ever raising their voices, who had others do their dirty work so they could keep their hands clean. She knew how they thought, knew what made them weak, and she knew exactly how to destroy them. She slipped inside unnoticed, dressed in a sleek black dress, her hair pinned in a way that made her look like she belonged. She moved through the crowd, her gaze flickering across faces, scanning for the man she had come to kill. It did not take long to find him. Ashford sat in the back, surrounded by men who looked just like him, wealthy, powerful, untouchable. He was laughing, his hand resting on the shoulder of a woman too young for him, his ring glinting under the low light. Lydia felt something hot and sharp coil in her chest. This was the kind of man who had given the orders in Magnolia Ridge. The kind of man who had made sure Aaron died afraid and alone. She did not hesitate. She picked up a glass of whiskey from a passing waiter's tray and walked straight to his table, slipping into an empty seat like she had been invited. Ashford barely noticed at first. Then his gaze slid toward her, and his smile widened. "Well now," he said, his voice smooth. "And who might you be?" Lydia tilted her head, letting her lips curve into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Someone you should be very afraid of." His brow furrowed, just for a second, but before he could react, before he could call for his men or reach for whatever weapon he thought would save him, Lydia leaned in and whispered the last words he would ever hear. "This is for Aaron." Then she slit his throat. The club erupted into chaos, screams and shouts echoing as Ashford's body slumped forward, his blood spilling across the table. Lydia was already moving, slipping through the panicked crowd, her pulse steady, her breath even. She did not run. She did not look back. By the time the police arrived, she was gone. The letter came 3 nights later. This time, there was no warning, no subtle threat. Just 4 words, written in neat, precise handwriting. "You have their attention." Lydia sat in the dim light of her rented room, staring at the words, feeling something stir in her chest. She had always been a girl caught between 2 worlds, the daughter of a powerful white man and a mother who had never truly belonged. She had spent her life being told who she was, what she could and could not do. But now, for the first time, she felt something else. Power. She was no longer running. No longer hiding. She was fighting. And she was just getting started. Lydia knew there was no turning back now. William Ashford's death had sent a ripple through the order, a crack in the foundation of men who had long believed themselves untouchable. And she had no doubt that they would come for her. But she wasn't afraid, not anymore. For too long, she had been on the run, waiting for the past to catch up with her, living like a ghost in the shadows of her own choices. But now, for the first time, she had chosen the fight. And if they wanted her, they would have to come and take her. Elijah and Josephine worked quickly. They had connections, people who had been waiting for the right moment to strike, people who had suffered under the order's power and were ready to burn it all down. New Orleans was a city of secrets, of rebellion hidden beneath music and laughter, and in the days that followed Ashford's death, Lydia saw it for what it was, a battlefield waiting to be ignited. Word spread quickly. The order had put a price on her head, and it wasn't just bounty hunters and mercenaries looking for her now. The police, the politicians, the powerful men who sat in rooms lined with oil paintings and whispered about controlling the country, they all wanted her dead. And yet, she remained. She moved carefully, never staying in one place too long, always watching, always listening. The city had eyes, and she could feel them on her wherever she went. But she was no longer the girl who had fled Magnolia Ridge in the dead of night, broken and afraid. She was something else now. Something sharper. Something dangerous. And so, when the next letter came, she was ready. Asterisk New York. The final piece. Asterisk, that was all it said. No threats. No warnings. Just an invitation. Elijah and Josephine argued about it. It was a trap, they said. A way to lure her out into the open, to finish what the order had started in Magnolia Ridge. But Lydia already knew she was going. She could feel the end approaching, a storm gathering at the edges of everything she had built, and she could not turn away now. This had never been about survival. It had never been about escaping the past. It was about finishing what she had started. About making sure Aaron's death meant something. And so, she boarded the train north, the weight of everything pressing down on her, the ghosts of Magnolia Ridge riding with her in the empty seats. The journey was long, and with each passing mile, she felt the news tighten. New York was nothing like the South, but power worked the same way everywhere. The men who ruled here wore different masks, but they were still the same. The order had its hands in everything, the banks, the law, the police. And if they had called her here, it meant they were ready to end this. But so was she. The address led her to an old hotel, grand in the way that only old money could be. Lydia stepped inside, the chandelier light glinting off the marble floor, the weight of 100 years of corruption pressing down on her. She had no weapons, no allies, just herself. And that was enough. The man waiting for her was not what she expected. He was old, older than she thought men like this could be. His suit was pristine, his silver hair neatly combed back, his blue eyes sharp as a blade. He smiled when she entered, like he had been expecting her all along. "Lydia Mercer," he said, his voice smooth, practiced. "You've been making quite the mess." Lydia did not answer. She stepped forward, her hands steady at her sides. "You wanted me here. So talk." The old man chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "You think this is about revenge? About punishment?" He shook his head. "No, my dear. This is about legacy." Lydia frowned, something cold settling in her gut. The man gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit. Let me tell you a story." She did not move. The man sighed, but there was no impatience in it, only something almost amused. "You think you've been fighting against the order, that you've been tearing down the men who built this country with blood and iron." He tilted his head. "But what if I told you that you were always part of it?" Lydia stiffened. What are you talking about? The man smiled, slow and knowing. Your father, he said simply. Did you ever wonder why he protected you for as long as he did? Why, despite everything, you were allowed to live in that house? Why, even when he knew what you were, he never cast you out? Lydia felt her breath catch. You're lying. Am I? The man said, lifting a single brow. You were never just some girl, Lydia. You were a Mercer. And the Mercers have always belonged to the Order. Lydia's pulse roared in her ears. It wasn't possible. Her father had been a cruel man, a distant man, a man who had never spoken of his world beyond the doors of their house. But she had always thought, always believed, that she was nothing more than his shame, his secret mistake. She had spent her whole life fighting against men like him. And now, this man was telling her that she had been one of them all along. No, she whispered, shaking her head. You're trying to confuse me. The man chuckled. Oh, my dear, I don't need to confuse you. The truth is already inside you. He leaned forward. Tell me, when you slit Ashford's throat, did it feel good? When you burned Magnolia Ridge to the ground, did you feel powerful? Lydia clenched her fists. I did what I had to do. The man's smile widened. Did you? Or did you simply do what was always in your blood? Lydia swallowed, a cold sweat breaking across her skin. If you think I'm going to stop, if you think I'm going to join you, you don't know me at all. The man sighed, almost disappointed. No, I suppose not. He lifted a hand, and before Lydia could react, the doors behind her burst open. Men stepped inside, men in dark suits, their eyes empty, their guns steady. Lydia did not move. She had come here knowing it might end this way. She had come here ready to die. But as she stared at the old man, at the truth written so clearly across his face, she realized something else. The fight had never been about erasing the past. It had never been about undoing what had been done. It was about becoming something new. Something different. Something no one, especially not the Order, had ever expected. She smiled. And then, before any of them could stop her, she lunged. The night was long. The city burned. When it was over, the Order was not gone. It never would be. But it was wounded. And Lydia Mercer? Lydia Mercer was no longer running. She was hunting. The gunfire had long since faded into the distant wail of sirens, the metallic taste of blood thick in the back of Lydia's throat as she moved through the darkened alleyways of New York, her dress torn, her hands shaking, but her heart still steady. The city was alive around her, pulsing with an energy that had nothing to do with her fight, nothing to do with the war she had waged within the walls of the old hotel where the Order had thought they would finish her. They had underestimated her. They had believed she was alone, that she was nothing more than a woman with a grudge, a girl too foolish to know when she was beaten. But they had been wrong. She had never been alone. Because the moment the first shot had been fired, the moment the first body had hit the marble floor, the city had responded. Elijah, Josephine, the people they had gathered in the weeks leading up to this night, they had been waiting, watching, preparing for the moment the Order would make its final move. And when the time had come, they had struck. The old hotel burned, the smoke curling into the sky like a funeral shroud. But Lydia did not stop to watch. There was no time for triumph, no time for celebration. The Order was wounded, but it was not dead. It would never be dead. Power did not die in a single night. It did not vanish because a few men had been killed in the dark. It shifted, it evolved, it hid beneath new masks and new names. And so, Lydia did not celebrate. She ran. Not out of fear. Not out of desperation. But because she understood what came next. The war was not over. It would never be over. But this battle, this night, it belonged to her. The next morning, the newspapers told a story. A fire, a riot, a sudden and unexplained act of violence that had left several prominent businessmen dead. The police blamed radicals, anarchists, faceless enemies that the city could fear without ever understanding. But Lydia knew the truth. The order would not say her name. They would not acknowledge her, not in public, not in a world where they still held power. But behind closed doors, in hushed voices, in rooms lined with the portraits of men who had built their wealth on the suffering of others, they would speak of her. And they would fear her. Days passed, then weeks. Lydia moved like a ghost through the world, never staying in one place for too long, always watching, always listening. The price on her head grew. The order sent men after her, men who thought they could end this with a bullet, with a blade, with whispered threats in the night. But none of them ever made it back. She was no longer running. She was hunting. And with every city, every whisper of the order's name, she drew closer to the heart of it all. She followed the money, the names, the families who had sat in power for generations, their hands clean while others did their killing for them. She tore through them like fire through dry fields, leaving behind nothing but ashes and fear. And then, one day, a letter arrived. No threats. No orders. Just a name. Nathaniel Mercer, her father. Lydia stared at the name for a long time, her hands gripping the paper so tightly that it crumpled in her grasp. She had spent her life fighting against the legacy of men like him, against the blood that had shaped her, against the weight of a name that had never truly been hers. And now, at the end of it all, she understood what had to be done. The war had started in Magnolia Ridge, but it would end with him. The Mercer estate had not changed. It stood as it always had, a monument to power, to history, to the unshakable belief that nothing could touch those who had built their world on the backs of others. The gates were open, as if her father had been waiting for her. She stepped inside, her footsteps silent against the stone path, the weight of the past pressing down on her with every step. The house was quiet. Too quiet. She moved through the halls, the memories clawing at her with every turn, every doorway. The dining room where she had once sat, silent and invisible, while her father spoke of things she had never been meant to hear. The parlor where her mother had stood, eyes hollow, a woman who had long since learned that love was not enough to survive in a world like this. And finally, his study. The door was open. He was waiting. Nathaniel Mercer sat behind his desk, his hands folded neatly in front of him, his expression unreadable as he watched her step inside. He did not look surprised. He did not look afraid. "Lydia," he said, his voice calm. "I was wondering when you would come home." She did not speak, did not move. He sighed, leaning back in his chair, studying her as if she were nothing more than a puzzle to be solved. "You've made quite a mess," he said. "But then, you always did have a talent for chaos." Lydia tilted her head, her fingers twitching at her side. "You knew," she said, her voice quiet, "about the order. About everything." Nathaniel smiled, slow and knowing. "Of course I knew." Her breath caught. "And Aaron?" His smile did not fade. "A necessary loss." The word struck like a blade to the gut, sharp and unforgiving. And in that moment, Lydia understood. This had never been about revenge. It had never been about justice. It had always been about him. About the man who had created her, shaped her, taught her how to survive in a world that had never been meant for her. And now, it would end with him. She reached for the knife at her belt, but before she could move, he spoke again. "Do you really think killing me will change anything?" he asked, his voice almost amused. "Do you think the order will fall because one man dies?" Lydia met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "No," she said. "But it's a start." The blade flashed. The blood came quickly. Nathaniel Mercer did not beg, did not plead. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable even as the life drained from his eyes. And then he was gone. Lydia stood there for a long time, the silence of the house pressing in around her. The war was not over. It never would be. But she had burned the roots. And now, it was time to disappear. She walked out of the house, out of the past, into the waiting night. The world was wide. The fight was endless, and Lydia Mercer was free. If you found this story moving and want to see more gripping, emotional tales, don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on the latest content. Your support means the world, and it helps us bring more stories to life. Thank you for being part of this journey.